Well, hello, my name is Jason Ingram. I have a background in church music, and not a lot of people know that because I've done a lot of nightclubs, I've done a lot of home recording over the years, and not to be confused with the songwriter Jason Ingram. That's why I put the T in there. Anyways, I wanted to talk a little bit about a problem that I see, especially when I visit small churches, is what we call mud. The worship music sounds muddy. You might be able to hear the voices, but the instruments kind of all sound like this. And they might be doing everything right. They all might be in tune. They're playing the right chords. They're all together, whatever it is, that it sounds muddy. And you can't really differentiate the sounds, the individual notes that they're playing. And there's a lot of reasons why it could be doing that. First thing is, and this is one of the big problems I notice, is the pastor says, the worship, it's wonderful, the Holy Ghost is there, it's just that it sounds bad, and I don't know why, so let's just throw money at it, especially in America. And typically, when they go to a music store, or they call Sweetwater Sound or something like that, well, you need a digital effects processor. Of course, you get some expert that's behind the soundboard, and he just said, we just need to get more stuff. So, Pastor, can we put in $1,000 more and get this digital effects processor? Maybe if we put reverb on it, it'll just kind of make everything sound kind of magical or something like that. Well, chances are the acoustics are bad because a small church doesn't usually have the knowledge and the funds to put acoustic sound absorbers and all that kind of stuff in there too. And some of it just has to do with, put some tapestries on there or egg cartons or whatever you need to do to make sure the room isn't, quote, live. You need kind of a dead sound unless you want that reverberation like cathedrals and stuff have. And a little bit of natural reverb isn't too bad. It might warm up the sound, but there's no reason to add digital reverb if you're in a building. If you're outside and you want that boomy sound for an effect or something like that, especially if it's a flute or something like that, that might be okay. But it adds distance, it creates mud. There's no reason to add reverb on somebody's vocals. It's not going to make a crappy singer sound better if you add reverb on it. Now, if you're making a recording, you can use reverb as an effect. And sometimes, like I say with my band, I have an ambient band, reverb covers a multitude of sins, or burying something in the mix. But when you're doing something live and you're not out there making a big performance, you want things clear, a lot of it has to do with the sound system. Here's another hint too, is take out the mid-range or try to find the frequency range that the vocals are in, which is somewhere in the middle. You have to figure it out based on the vocal range of the singers and stuff like that. But basically, just kind of eyeball it. Take out a lot of the mids and have a smiley in your instruments. So the bass and the keys and the guitars shouldn't have a lot of mid-range because that's going to fight with your vocals. And so that's another thing to do as well. Here's the big thing. And this is what I noticed playing in nightclubs with a lot of small bands. And you get a bunch of folks, especially if they're volunteers and they think that they're just God's gift to arranging and stuff like that, is typically the band will arrange itself unless the leader of the band knows how to arrange, knows how to tactfully delegate artists and musicians, especially volunteers. Because people that don't get paid typically feel entitled to do whatever the heck they want. And if that's the case, then we can guide folks into saying, hey, this is what I want. On your guitar, cut out a lot of the mid-ranges if you have one of those EQs like my acoustic guitar has. It's a plug-in. And when it comes to arranging, this is where things get a little tricky. Here's the rule. There should be one musician playing chords. It's either the keyboard that's going to play chords and the guitar playing embellishments, or typically someone's leading on guitar. Or if somebody seeds a song, like if a leader is playing the keyboard and they start a song on the keys in order to get the tempo right and the feel right, then they should lay off of the chords, especially if they're playing bass notes and there's a bass player, you're going to fight with that, and the frequencies are going to fight with each other, even if you're playing the same notes. But if someone's playing, G over G and the bass player's playing a B over G, which works, it's just that when you have both of them playing a bass note, even though they're both chord tones, they're going to fight with each other, especially when you get all those overtones going on as well, and you will get mud. And I've seen that happen a lot too. So if there's a keyboard player, you got to remember that if they're playing a full drawbar organ sound, if you know much about keys and especially organs or drawbars, stuff like that, that's a term that we use. Basically, there's a lot of overtones. So when you play a C, you're going to hear a G, you're going to hear an E, you're going to hear all these other notes. It sounds really full, especially a church organ. It's just that you have all those overtones going on, especially if you're playing a big 3 or 4 note chord or two-handed players. A lot of times keyboard players are used to playing by themselves and they want to play two-handed all the time, even though there's a bass player and there's a guitar player and they're playing the bass and the chords. The keyboard player is playing the bass and the chords. And if it's a full drawbar organ sound, you're getting a lot of mud because you're getting a lot of overtones. And here's the thing that a lot of people don't realize too, is that a piano sound, a sampled piano sound, even an acoustic piano actually can give you more mud as well. But especially the older, like Kurzweil's and some of these older sampled piano sounds are going to give you a sound that's supposed to carry its weight on its own, especially when you're doing the mid-range. And when you're playing with a band, it's going to fight with the frequencies of a guitar. Now, an acoustic guitar is also going to have a lot of overtones because you're going to have a big frequency spectrum. That's why electric guitars can actually sound more soothing if you don't add distortion to it or a crunch sound, or if you don't have a fancy hotshot stack of amplifiers. An electric guitar, you can change the EQ so easily by your tone knobs and all that stuff, and you can get a nice deep tone. And especially if you're playing high notes and you cut the highs, you get this wonderful, almost electric piano kind of sound, which leads me to my next thing. When it comes to keyboard players, the best sound that I have found, especially when you're doing embellishments, is an electric piano sound. Or if you want to sound 90s, they call it digital e-piano. If you want to sound like old school Hosanna Integrity or something like that. And you're going to chase away your young people probably when they hear that sound, like, oh, I heard that as a kid. Oh, that drives me crazy. But the classic electric piano sound, the Rhodes, the Suitcase, the Wurlitzer, those kind of ones like that. And if there's not a lot of mid-range, but they're just warm tones, and if you don't have a whole bunch of bright tones going on, then it's going to sound soothing to people. A lot of times a worship team not only sounds muddy, but you get a lot of high tones, and you want to leave those high tones free, because a lot of vocal sounds like the S's and the F's and things like that, you'll want to hear those because you're basically the lead vocal is the most important thing you'll want to hear in a worship team, because that's what's leading people, and that's what they need to hear clearly, especially if they don't know the song. If everybody knows the song and you get mud and they're watching their lips and they get an idea and the congregation is singing, it's not a big deal. You can get mud, especially a lot of times people like to turn it up too loud. If you have a pastor who's half deaf, or you got a sound person who's been running sound for a long time, typically, especially if they've been playing in outdoor clubs and a lot of stuff where there's a lot of loud music, and a lot of churches are really loud, and that can cause ear damage over a long period of time. And it's not just ear damage as far as like not being able to hear a certain amount of decibels, it's your high tones. A lot of folks with hearing damage can't hear high tones, and if they're playing an instrument, you'll hear a lot of high overtones because they can't hear those. So, it's really hard to like go over to a guitar player and say, hey, can I cut, where it says that sometimes it'll say presence, or it'll say high, mids, and lows. Just cut your highs down, cut down your presence, or try to adjust if there is some type of overdrive or distortion or whatever it is. And distortion can sound really good and soothing if you cut those highs off. Other than that, you'll get something that will resemble heavy metal, and there's some churches that like that. And so one of the big things I notice is not only settings you can do on your soundboard, settings you can do on your instruments, but the arranging is also just as important. And you don't have to worry about trying to do acoustical engineering in your church. Chances are that's a small percentage, and you're going to waste a lot of time and money trying to hire an acoustical engineer or trying to buy professional stuff to put on the walls, which in fact a lot of it is just get a bunch of old ladies and ask them to donate some quilts and put the quilts on the walls. That'll do almost as good of a job, and still, it's not a huge issue. One of the biggest issues is trying to arrange volunteers who aren't used to being told how to play and what to play. That's a tough thing because they're used to just doing their own thing. And the big thing too is the infamous lead guitar. Oh, we got a rhythm guitar player, we got the keyboard player, and then we got the lead guitar. And the lead guitar, even in slow worship, especially in fast praise music, is they're just noodling the whole time. I can't tell you how many churches I've seen. And the thing is, you might have a pastor that say, hey, we want to make this more seeker friendly. Let's get some rock and roll going on. And maybe people get more excited and they'll think this is a cool church. And then you get some people that are like, that guitar is annoying. I wish they would stop. So instead of calling it lead guitar, here's what you do. When you hire somebody, make sure they know ahead of time, because if they're used to noodling and they think they got the Holy Ghost and they're in another zone of their own and they're basically shutting off everybody else, which happens, especially with drummers, is you got somebody who thinks lead guitar is basically noodling over everything, or maybe they give them a little time to do something, but that usually doesn't happen. Like, hey, let's stop the worship and let's give them a solo so everybody can stop singing and look at this lead guitar player on a Sunday morning, and that doesn't happen very often, unless you're Morning Star Worship or something like that, where they really know what they're doing. So instead of calling it lead guitar, say you're going to do embellishments. The lead guitar player is going to play chords that are up high and play sustaining chords and maybe some very mellow riff type stuff, or maybe even some, because it's funny, the last 20 years or so there's been a trend of this U2 thing, like The Edge, and actually The Edge had some great he was a guitar player for U2, or still is, I'm sure they're still together. He had a lot of great ideas because it was lead guitar and rhythm guitar at the same time. That there was a lot of embellishments, there was a lot of suspended fours and suspended twos, if you know what those are, and things like that. Just as long as everything's in the same mode, everything's in the same key, and they're not trying to play minor over a major, which a lot of guitar players do. So that's another thing too. And here's the thing, is that if you have a keyboard player, even if they're playing chords, let's say hopefully one-handed, and they're playing leads, like they're the singer and they're playing the chords, and if there's a bass player, they should just get rid of their left hand and let the bass player handle that. And there's an acoustic guitar. The acoustic guitar can do some things. They can find out what register that the keyboard player is playing at, and they choose a different octave, higher or lower octave. Acoustic guitars sound really nice when they're up high, and sometimes you can capo on the 12th fret and you could get some pretty nice sounds. And here's the thing, is it's the dreaded open G chord, is just adds mud all the time, especially when you're playing that B note as well. And so those are things to avoid. So if you capo up high, especially an octave, and you don't have to transpose that way, then you'll get some really nice embellishments, especially if you're just playing chords like halfway through the measure or every other measure. Then it adds dynamics to it, and it's great. Another thing too, speaking of dynamics, is that some folks can kind of fade out to an ambient level and then come in at different parts of the song, and that sounds really nice. And here's the big thing. When you have a band that arranges itself, basically you're just telling everybody plays all the time. And a really good arranged worship team, especially when you go to like a mega church or something like that, you'll often have a verse or a chorus where one of the instruments or two of the instruments sits out entirely, especially the drummer. The drummer needs to just stop a lot. And what happens is that, I see this in nightclubs too, because it's so funny when you're dealing with a lot of improvised music and a lot of amateur players, that you don't have a lot of choice on who's going to join your team. And especially when you got these worship teams, is that typically they have either a high moral code, which eliminates a lot of creative people, or you got people that aren't following the moral code that seem like they're trying. Which I see a lot of times too. And so they don't have a lot of choices on who they can work with. And if that's the case, then if they are teachable, which is always a big word that I heard in churches, which is a great quality to have. You don't always have that, especially when I was a music teacher and I was leading or arranging worship teams. And a lot of the people that were literally twice my age, I had one guy got so mad he stormed off, and it turned into a big mess. Because I thought, well, here he's been playing this instrument for a long time and he doesn't know how to play it. And I'm in charge. I might as well tell him how to play it. Big mistake. So it's hard to be tactful because you don't have a lot of choices with who you're working with. But there's so many things you can do to avoid musical mud. And a lot of it has to do with the drummer, because you're only as loud as your drummer is. And if your drummer is overpowering everybody, then that's a problem. And of course, electronic drums are a joke to most drummers. And a lot of times they just put them in behind plexiglass, which is torture for the drummer because they're just hearing themselves like crazy. And then they put a lid over it sometimes too. So finding a dynamic drummer that's willing to play with, there's something called bundle sticks, which are really nice, which are like little wooden dowels glued together. They might last a couple of Sundays and they fall apart, but still, even though they're expensive, there are alternatives to make things quieter. There are some things like plastic brushes, which are just, you can't hear the ride cymbal at all. I mean, you just can't. So there's some things that just don't work. So ask your drummer what they're willing to do. And a lot of times it's that freaking hi-hat. They want to play that hi-hat really loud. So if they can control the volume of the hi-hat, that's usually the biggest thing that causes mud. But here's the thing, is that the muddy stuff that a drummer usually does is mostly in the high ends. So you don't have to worry about that too much. Unless they're playing a whole bunch of medium toms, that doesn't happen. Most of the sounds you hear out of a drum set that will cause mud are higher toms. And you can do that by getting different cymbals. But then again, my whole point is not to throw money at stuff. You need to learn what you're doing and ask around and, do more YouTube tutorials and hear it from people who have experience in the industry, whether they're playing in nightclubs or churches. The principles are pretty similar. So thanks for watching, and I want to do more about worship teams because I've been on and off over the last few years. I have been visiting a few churches just because I'm curious. I kind of miss that. And I see the same problems going on, and they're really simple problems, and you don't really need to buy new equipment in order to solve them. So, hey, happy worshiping, and I hope this helps.